All right, contradictions. People love to talk about the ridiculousness of a worldwide flood. I just talked to a guy yesterday about this. He says, I said, well, take a look at all the mountaintops. They all have marine life on them. Did an ocean go to those top of those mountains or whatever? Every mountain range you go to, you got mountains with marine life on the top of them. It's like there was an ocean above them. And there were local floods that devastate the entire area regionally and completely transform the topical area, the surface of the earth around that area. So some of the implied physical changes after the flood are as follows, which we look as plausible, and then look around, scientifically look at things. The oceans were much more extensive since they now contain all the waters, which were once above the firmament and the subterranean reservoirs of the great deep. The land areas were much less extensive than before the flood, with a much greater portion of its surface uninhabitable for this reason. And the canopy top had been dissipated so that strong temperature differentials were inaugurated, leading to a gradual buildup of snow and ice in the polar latitudes, rendering much of the extreme northern and southern land surfaces also essentially uninhabitable, North and South Pole. Mountain ranges uplifted after the flood. There's such a thing as uplifting. We don't have to make the Bible say it, but geologists can tell you about it. Emphasize the more rugged topography of the post-Diluvian after the flood area of the continents, with many of these regions also becoming unfit for human habitation. Winds and storms, rains and snows were possible now, thus rendering the total environment less congenial to man and animals than had once been the case. The environment was also more hostile because of harmful radiation from space, no longer filtered out by the vapor canopy. Or was there, I would correct that, it was probably a highly frozen ice canopy, where the hydrogen was so cold, it was so cold that the hydrogen acted like a metal, resulting along with contributing environmental factors in gradual reduction in human longevity after the flood. The ice canopy, rather than the vapor canopy, which Henry Morse maintains, but the vapor canopy would be too cloudy. In any case, the oxygen level would be much higher and people would live longer, and so would they grow bigger like plants and animals. Tremendous glaciers, rivers, and lakes existed for a time, with the world only gradually approaching its present state of semi-aridity. Because of the tremendous physiographic and isostatic movements generated by the collapse of the subterranean caverns which had the water also, and the post-flood uplifts, the crust of the earth was in a state of general instability, reflected in recurrent volcanic and seismic activities all over the world for many centuries and continuing in some degree even to the present. And the lands, point 9, were barren of vegetation until some time as plant life could be reestablished through the sprouting seeds and cuttings buried beneath the surface. There is even a possibility that the Earth's rotation speeded up by about 1.5% if the year was really 360 days long. Scattered around on the land surfaces were occasional rotting carcasses and skeletons of the animals and people doomed in the waters of the flood, a vivid reminder of the ungodliness of the antediluvian world and the fate from which God had delivered the survivors. Since the new land surfaces probably had been formed mainly from the pre-diluvian seas filled with sediments and then uplifted, much more such remains were buried in the sediments beneath the land surfaces. Hence we have the geological strata, not by ages, by just a short 6 months of a huge amount of water. These sediments were rapidly being lithified through the eroded and dissolved cementing agents present in the waters, the flood waters that had deposited the sediments, thus becoming the great beds of fossil-bearing sedimentary rocks that are now found everywhere around the world. By the way, not consistently the same everywhere you go. Lots of differences. The fossils so preserved were not heterogeneously dispersed throughout the sediments, but were generally deposited in a certain statistical order. And you'll read about this. It's sphericity, how spherical, and density. First, more spherical and the denser, and those that are usually the smaller shell-type life forms. From the more simple marine invertebrate organisms, which are on the bottom, which that's what they were, the smaller ones with shells and so on, to complex land vertebrates near the top, which weren't dense. Mammals were much less dense and not spherical. They were amorphous shape. This is in the order of increasing elevation of natural habitat, with fossil assemblages tending to be buried in association with the same ecological communities in which they had lived, because waves would take it away, and one wave would take a lot of stuff away and slam it to another wave in that same region and deposit what it already had. Increasing ability to flee from the encroaching floodwaters, that would be the mammals and humans, increasing resistance to hydrodynamic forces, and therefore an increasing tendency to be transported farther and deposited more slowly. Thus, in general, at any one locality, there would be a definite tendency for similar kinds of animals to be buried at about the same levels, similar meaning size, shape, spherical or not, and density, and for different kinds to be buried in order of increasing size and complexity. So the more complex the animal, the less dense it is, and then the later it's buried. This order is exactly what is commonly found in the sedimentary rocks, with many statistical exceptions. Many statistical exceptions, of course, as is to be expected of such catastrophic phenomena as were occurring during the flood. And thus this clearly confirms the predictions based on the flood's model as outlined in the biblical record. However, it has been deplorably misinterpreted by modern uniformitarian geologists. Uniformitarian geologists say, things the way we see them today, that's the way they've always been. But now they're beginning to look and say, we can't find missing links or all kinds of things. Well, those changes were happening in between the rock strata, like an imaginary idea, just to support their point of view. So, uniformitarian geologists teach gradual evolution of life from simple marine invertebrate organisms to complex land vertebrates. Well, that's how they would be buried, because the simple invertebrate ones would be denser and more spherical and smaller. The complex would be larger, less dense, and various forms, not spherical. Through long geological ages, short time, spherical would bury very quickly, along with the rest of the animals later on, more complex, and just a worldwide flood will do that in a matter of seconds. If evolutionists have arranged these supposed geological ages in a supposed chronological order, purportedly extending vertically upward through the geological column of sedimentary rocks deposited above the crystalline rocks on the bottom. The fossils found in these rocks, proceeding supposedly from simple to complex, comprise their best evidence for the theory of organic evolution. Thus, if the fossiliferous deposits are mainly records of the flood year, instead of millions of years of upward evolutionary struggle, the entire evolutionary system is scientifically bankrupt. There is little wonder, therefore, that the concept of the geological ages is defended with such fervor, and that flood geology is ridiculed and ignored. But the flood is more plausible. We've seen smaller floods, like one in northern California, that formed a mini Grand Canyon with rock strata in a matter of 9 hours. One should recognize, too, that nowhere in the world does the so-called geological column actually occur. It is possible for any vertical sequence of these ages, or any portion of them, to exist in any given locality. Any age may be on the bottom, and any on top, and any in between. The contained fossils, rather than vertical superposition or any other physical feature of the formation, constitute the controlling factor in the age assigned to it. Thus, the theory of evolution is assumed in building up the geological column, and then the latter is taken as the main proof of the theory of evolution, but it's in the textbooks, but never consistently in real life. The fossils in this geological column, however, speak eloquently of death, and therefore they must have been deposited after Adam's fall and God's curse. Thus, both the biblical and scientific data, rightly understood, show that the Earth's great fossil graveyards must be, for the most part, have been buried by the flood and its after effects. The record in the rocks is not a testimony to evolution, but rather to God's sovereign power and judgment of sin, on sin. We can keep on going. We've done quite a number of these YouTubes on the worldwide flood, and it builds evidence upon evidence upon evidence of a catastrophic event lasting not more than 6 months. So we have a number of theories. The day-age theory, you can go into this. And K14, we have the biblical account. We have then scientific accounts that support the evidence which supports it all. Here's your location. When we go more on the next thing, I'd like to go back to Romans chapter 8. Now, we showed that the insertion in Romans 8:1 of the last phrase of that verse was after the fact, in later centuries. Somebody just decided he didn't like the way that was read, some scribe or something. So let's look at whether or not evidence about what Paul wrote also declares that there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, over and out. Nothing else has to be done. You become in Christ, which is simply to believe, Ephesians 1:13-14, and then Paul declares you're under no condemnation, no matter how well you follow through on your Christian life. More on this next time on Romans chapter 8.